number of business units. Nextier Power, that's focused on working with folks in the power sector. Advisory, which I head up, that looks at broad governance issues across Nigeria. We've got Nextier Security, Peace and Development. Unfortunately, the gentleman who leads it is not here today, but he focuses more on security and conflict issues in the Niger Delta and the Northeast, and everything in between. There are issues everywhere. We try to use this platform, Development Discourse, to talk about big policy issues that affect us in Nigeria. We've used it, X-ray issues from corruption to Boko Haram to election challenges to Biafra, which we had President Obasanjo at that particular discussion. We're pleased to have this opportunity today to explore state building in an emerging democracy. But before we get into it, I think it would be good to just do a quick round of introductions around the room. And afterwards, as you can see from the agenda, I'll pass it over to Larry to make some opening remarks. And I'll then introduce Professor Joseph, who leads the introduction, and he will make his remarks, some Q&A with me, and then we'll open it up to everyone. So maybe I start on this side and we walk the microphone down the road.
My name is Henry Ugover. I run the media communication firm here in Abuja.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Saad Kamali. I'm the director of the Abuja Development Discourse.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nextier Advisory. I'm a senior legal advisor of the Power Program.
Good morning. The name is Chinedu Nibula. I'm a consultant in the niche sector.
I'm a veteran US. I'm a retired teacher.
Good morning. Jerome Okolo is my name, National Think Tank.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Babatunde Ajala. I am political and community officer at the Swiss Embassy.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ifoma Obanabo. I'm an independent financial management consultant.
Good morning. Danlami Gomwok, the lead for trade with the DDF program.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Nana Ode, CEO at my contractor.
Good morning. I'm Aura Deason, and I'm a research manager currently with the Development Governance program.
Good morning, I'm Yanni Booker, and I work at CPC.
Good morning, I'm Andy Madaki. I'm an information security consultant and part of the Abuja Global Shapers.
My name is Frank, the Brussels Advisory.
Good morning, my name is Emmett Obobara. I'm with Nextier Tower.
Good morning, my name is Wani Odete. I'm a cultural affairs assistant at the U.S. Embassy.
My name is Jude Ojarade. I lead the PFID Kimbay project, market development in the Niger Delta.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Teniola Tayo, and I work with Nextier Advisory.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Tayo Deer. I'm with Nextier Power.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Larry Socha. I'm the Cultural Affairs Officer at the Embassy of the United States here in Abuja. I want to thank Patrick and all of you for joining us here this morning. It's really a fantastic opportunity for us at the Embassy to be able to support the series of lectures that Dr. Joseph is presenting beginning yesterday at the National Institute for Legislative Studies, continuing this morning with this smaller discussion, which I'm really looking forward to, then in Lagos and Ibadan, and wrapping up with a conversation about INEC and elections, looking forward on Monday in Kano State. It's my pleasure as the Cultural Affairs Officer at the Embassy to host speaker programs, but also to host exchange programs. The Embassy offers over 20 different exchange programs, including the Fulbright program, which I know Professor Joseph was a recipient and participant of a couple years ago at the University of Ibadan. And I hope many of you, or in support of your colleagues, will take advantage of the Fulbright or the Humphrey or any of our professional programs. We have a number of youth programs, of course, so if you have children or you are a mentor to young people, our Youth Exchange and Study Program, or even the Mandela Washington Fellowship Program, which I'm sure a couple of you are familiar with. We have several programs like the Fulbright Program that are focused on mid-career professionals and their development. And so all that information is, of course, available at our website, ng.usembassy.gov. You can locate any information about our exchange programs there at any time. But again, it's my pleasure to be part of this conversation this morning, beginning yesterday with Dr. Joseph's talk on affirming democracy amid insecurity and uncertainty. There were a number of good questions about how Nigeria can move forward as a democracy. And in that paper, which is available at Dr. Joseph's website, Africa Plus, if you just Google Africa Plus, the WordPress website will come up, and you can read his lecture from yesterday. I thought it was amazing how we went from James Madison and Benjamin Franklin to Nigerian scholars like Rotimi Subru of today. So it's quite a piece. I encourage you to read it and stay tuned to that resource to hear more about Dr. Joseph's thoughts. But with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Patrick, for a formal introduction.
Thank you very much, Larry. And as we were doing the introductions, Dr. Arthur Martins Agina walked in. He's the coordinator of the Kuka Center. They're doing a lot of work on conflict resolution across the country. Ladies and gentlemen, just permit me a few minutes to do some quick introduction, but let me start with two quotes. The first is from the book Democracy and Prebendal Politics in Nigeria, 1987. Until Nigerians find a way to create institutions which can remain part of the state and not become instruments susceptible to being captured by factions of society which win temporarily control of the state, any hope of a constitutional democracy is likely to be regularly frustrated. The second quote from State Governance and Democratic Development. Nigeria must move to the forefront in the region, in the continent, and globally in interwoven ways, building effective state institutions, advancing democracy, and democratizing development. Why can Nigerians build and operate mega churches, but not quality public transport, public universities, public energy utilities, and other service organizations? Both of these quotes are obviously from Professor Joseph. Ladies and gentlemen, we're extremely fortunate to have with us today one of the most distinguished Africanists and political scientists, Richard Joseph, who is the John Evans Research Professor of International History and Politics at Northwestern University. His 1978 book, Democracy and Prebendal Politics in Nigeria, became one of the defining political science books on Nigeria, and he continued this success with his 1999 book, State, Conflict and Democracy in Africa, and many other books. He previously taught at Emory University, which happens to be my alma mater, Dartmouth College, University of California at Los Angeles, University of Ibadan, and University of Khartoum in Sudan. He's held research fellowships at Harvard University, Boston U, MIT, Institute of Development Studies in Success UK, Christian Michelsen Institute Norway, and the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in France. He has devoted his scholarly career to the study of politics and governance in Africa with a special focus on democratic transitions, state building and state collapse, and conflict resolution. He directed the Africa Governance Program at the Carter Center, 88 to 94, and coordinated election missions in Zambia in 91, Ghana in 92, and peace initiatives in Liberia in 91 to 94. He has been a long-time member of the Council for Foreign Relations. He is a recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, including a Rhodes Scholarship, a Kent Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship. In 2002 to 3, he held the visiting professorship at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the National Endowment for Democracy. He was a Fulbright Scholar in France and also a Fulbright Professor at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. Ladies and gentlemen, with a round of applause. Please permit me to hand it over to Professor Wilson.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick. I'm so delighted that my good friend Bibula Buluwaji was able to put us in touch with you, and you were able to very quickly arrange this event, and that Larry and his colleagues were able to put it all together. So some things do work in Nigeria. And of course, it's a real pleasure to see so many familiar faces around the table. Some of us go back a real long way. Remember when you invited me to, to Ohio there years ago, and you had to convince them. I said, why we need to pay an honorarium to this guy? No, anyway, of course, Jerome. We've had such wonderful conversations, Jerome. Anyway, the timing could have been better for my being here. I literally submitted my students' grades, completed the term papers, and then got on my plane to head out here. And even in preparing the talk yesterday, you'll see some of the people quoted there. In fact, they come straight out of some of the teaching I was doing this past quarter. But anyway, you happen to have chosen absolutely, brilliant topic, and so let me, make a few remarks about. And I'm making the remarks really in the context of work that I'm doing at Northwestern. This is a period, I'm at a point in my career when, later on this year, a volume of my papers on Nigeria. I've had research assistants working on it for some time, distilling it and so on. And then Northwestern has just created an entity called Arch Library. And so this is going to be one of the first projects, and it covers, my writings on Nigeria from March 1977, the conference on the draft constitution in Zaria, all the way up to, my most recent, publications on Africa Plus. But we'll make that available. And also, there's a lot, and I'm really thinking about, deepening the level of engagement. And I can assure you that even, on the way here, I'm already thinking of what I'm going to be doing from the time I arrive back to follow up. So stay tuned. You'll be hearing from me on, because I'm so great to learn of Nextier because it's a very important component when I think of partners in the kind of work we'll be doing. When I teach, I used to, one of my courses at the University of Ibadan was the theory of the state. And I always remember the first time I taught it, the students who enrolled, I could teach them we had these big, offices at UI. Those were generous days. So I used to be able to teach my class only about like a dozen students. The next time I came to teach my course on the theory of the state, and it was assigned a classroom. And so I came down the corridor and I looked in, and I saw all of these students in there, like over 100 students. And so I closed the door and I got the wrong place, And then I figured, wait a second. I went back in, opened the door, and then I said, "Are you all here for what course are you all here for?" They said, "No, theory of the state." And I said something kind of silly. I said, "You're here for theory of the state? It's a difficult course." And the students anyway. So that was the start. I went very quickly from, but anyway. And in teaching my courses on Africa, I usually have to spend a few classes getting students to think about the state. Especially in the United States, most students don't even know what the state is. Unlike Europe, where you have, the state tradition, étatisme. I mean, people would have a sense of what the state is. Most Americans, you say, what is the state? They puzzle. State, government, country. I mean, they don't understand what's the nature of the state. And it's absolutely fundamental. But let me just try and race ahead. And maybe the talk that I'm giving on Friday, and obviously that talk is an evolution as I'm really confronted with some of the burning questions here in Nigeria. And so I'm going to be, I haven't finalized that, so I'll be able to, combine the two, the questions that are being asked and some of the ideas in it. But let me start off with, as I was preparing the talk, and then thinking about the Nigerian state, and then I became aware that there is a term. I mean, it's the same thing like coming up with prebendalism. Where I'm, studying the making of the Nigerian Second Republic, and I'm going around meeting people and so on, and all of a sudden I, start buzzing in my head. There's a term that corresponds to what I'm learning here. I had to go back and, open up my Max Weber and all of it, and that's how I happened to, land on that and develop it. And I mentioned two things in that connection. The first thing was, so as I was doing it, I thought, wait a second. I mean, there is this symbol, this historical symbol of a serpent and a serpent that circles on itself and eats its own tail. So I Googled it, and of course now in Google, and yes, here it comes up. There is this Greek figure, which in fact I have it in my, I have a copy of it, and it is of a serpent, and it comes from, it came from Egypt, this notion, and was taken over from, into Greek mythology. I had to adjust the name of it a little bit, but the two portions of the name were Ura and then Boros, and then it stood for for eating and the tail. But anyway, so this idea of a serpent that eats its own tail. I'm thinking about the Nigerian state, and of course with my notion of prebendalism is where offices, as everybody understands now in Nigeria, Nigerians are experts at using the concept, where offices are prebend, and namely which are used to generate income for the office holder, for their cronies, and for their support group. And in the context of Nigeria's sectionalism, ethnic divisions and so on, it becomes very much wrapped up and bound up, becomes a form of ethno-clientelism. So anyway, and I had worked that all out in a 1983 article, long before the book. If you go and read the 1983 article, you'll see the theory and everything else was completely laid out. And I've been really puzzling over, we had Wale Adebanwi, who we had some forums on democracy and insecurity, and he gave a talk. And I don't know if you're familiar with any of Adebanwi's work, but it's pretty blistering. Excuse me. Well, yeah, and he had to change the title when he published it internationally. He thought that'd be too much for people internationally to call it that. But he calls it, authority stealing. But anyway, and I had him speak on the topic of African labyrinths, and of course dealing with it. But, so the criticisms he was making, and you will see it, I circulated a copy of my talk from yesterday where I cited some of the things from his, talking about the state in Nigeria and democracy in Nigeria. And also, Biodun Jefo, my very good friend and colleague. We're all, at University of Ibadan. There are a group of us who were there at the time, and even some of our former students. And his book on Against the Predatory Republic, the collection of his writings. And then he has a section in there where he talked about, and I knew he was building a house in his hometown. I think it's Okebola, but in the southwest. And he describes the situation of, of course, not having electricity, not having water, right? So having to provide for his own electricity, his backup generators, and all of that. And then, he talks about, even the trash disposal of the services not being there and having to make. So, and he says, well, the municipalities used to take care of so many of these things, and now he's in a position, and we all know that, of having to provide so much of these basic fundamental aspects of it. Right? And so what we get into here, and I thank you for reading those quotes, is just fundamentally but maybe I could work without this for a while. Not being able to have a state system that can provide the basics, that one expects of the state, right? And the idea that people have to become their own states, company has to become their own states, all of these things. So the problem I want to get to the state in Nigeria is not only my prebendal work and states being converted to generate resources and therefore not provide public services. I am talking about a state that is a self-devouring state. The state devours itself, right? And so you have an entity that is supposed to be a state, right, representing the collective public power, but then that state itself, is eroding the very instruments that is supposed to be carrying out these duties. Right? So in many ways I'm saying that, 30 years ago I realized we had a serious problem in Nigeria. I was going to do my book on the making of the Second Republic and everything else, and mirroring the American books and so on, and the elections and so on. And then found myself having to grapple with this theoretical analysis and framework to explain, what was going to make it very difficult for the system to succeed. In fact, and I mentioned it in my talk, that I used to say to people about when they would ask me about the Second Republic, I used to say, I hope I can finish my book before the Republic collapses. Because there was no way in which, the way in which it was functioning, people coming in and taking control of it. All right. So moving on from there, and in terms of the present situation, where we are in, right now. A lot of the issues that, before us, and then one other aspect I want to bring up, and I'm going to be speaking about this in Lagos, right? There is a notion that is implicit in a lot of my work, implicit in a lot of the works of a lot of colleagues, and which I'm going to be trying to bring a little bit to the fore. A conglomerate, as you know, is an agglomeration where you have units that are able, they are part of a whole, but they maintain their separate identities. And the sort of origins of this thinking about conglomerate governance, there are two specific sources I'll mention here. The first source was a conversation I had with Malam Turi Mohamedou, known to some of you, former managing director for many years of the New Nigeria. And I remember in one of my interviews, at that time in the late 70s, and we were talking about the federal structure of Nigeria. And, the different provisions that people were discussing. And then he said something to me. He said, Richard, I want to tell you something. Whatever the formal stipulations about the federation, Nigeria, at its very heart, is a cultural federation. And that idea has stayed with me. All right, it's a very fundamental. This is a federation that you have. You might think of it in things of units and states and divisions and so on. But fundamentally, this is it. And I've seen that idea emerge and emerge again. And right now, in fact, it's re-emerging again in great force. And the second thing was a fellow named Kenneth Post, a British political scientist, sociologist, and Michael Vickers wrote a book on Nigeria. And in that book, they talked about Nigeria as a conglomerate society. And again, I'm not going to go into some of the details. And in my prebendal politics, you'll see I have a chapter on the making the politics of an ethnic system. Right? Before I talked about the prebendalism, there's that chapter of thinking about Nigeria as the emergence of an ethnic system. Right? Now, what I'm saying is that I'm going to be carrying that forward in my discussions and having people be a little more conscious of it, of how, that the backdrop to a lot of thinking in Nigeria still falls within this idea of Nigeria being an agglomeration of peoples. And those of you familiar with the work of Peter Eke and others will see how that is obvious in there. Now, there's no problem with that. I mean, it just happened to be a fact of how Nigeria happened to be put together, the history of Nigeria. But it is put together in a way that, and here I will just stop because I don't want to get into too much theory. I mean, I do plan to come back, and I was just mentioning I got to come back and get into the classroom back here in Nigeria. But what I want to mention is that, and in fact, I have an article I did some time ago about the trajectory of the nation state, in Africa, nation state trajectories, and I just want to say a word about the trajectories. That the emergence of a state is the emergence of an entity that is universal in that territory, right? It doesn't belong to anybody. It's that kind of an entity. That is what a state is supposed to be, right? And then, if you know, some of the history of France is where, in fact, we use the term nation-state, but quite often a more appropriate term, but it's awkward, so we don't use it, is state-nation. That you create a state, and once you have a state, use that state to forge a nation. And the France is very much, a real typical of that, all right? But anyway, the idea of state building is that you're creating an entity that is universal, right? And an entity that can acquire a certain degree of autonomy from civil society. Those of you who are familiar with my book would remember the diagrams that I've, and when I'm teaching, there's always a point when I jump up and I go to my board and I start, drafting things for students. So I just do it when I'm reading too, right? Writing. But anyway, the book is where I show that, showing the idea of what a state is like. Here is a state, there is a society, right? And you have individuals trying to access that state, as all of you do. You have to bring, to your representatives, you need things to do. You access that state, and then that state has authority and is then it's authoritative in its commands on society, right? But what prebendalism does is that those forces within the society are able to go in and capture parts of the state. And now, instead of that state having that corporate existence, it becomes fragmented within that. All right, so this person gets control of this particular office, and that office now is captured by whoever it is and so on. And so you get a fragmented. And over a period of time, that state is not able to be effective in its work. The idea of conglomerate governance to that, right, is the idea that not only do you have individuals taking control, of pieces of the state and using it in ways, but there is a sense of Nigeria as of a conglomerate, still a conglomerate society in some very fundamental sense. And that state is, how much is that state really serving our interests? all right, that conglomerate thinking. Now, right now, with a lot of discussions about, true federalism, Biafra, and all of that, we have the resurgence of some of that thinking. And so, while we are desperately trying to get the progress in terms of the institutions of the state, and this is why in my talk yesterday, I talked about the Electoral Commission, right? And to see how that Electoral Commission, how it was able to undergo all of the improvements and radical and reforms that were conducted under Tahiru Jega, and therefore to be able to be as effective it was in the 2015 elections, right? And similarly, we can look at, and it's something I'm really thinking about as one of the projects going forward, we can look at some of the other core institutions in Nigeria. And for example, the one that is just there in my mind is the judiciary. And what has happened to the judiciary, and based on what I need to know. But you could go all the way along all the different core institutions, and how we can, and I came up with this term, I'm saying, yes, we want to affirming democracy, but in affirming democracy, we have to firm up the institutions of that democracy, all right? So bear in mind that as we're trying to firm up those institutions, get them to be more state-like, right, in their functioning, if at the same time we have a resurgence because of all of the, dissatisfactions and so on, but we have a resurgence of an ethno-political thinking as the agenda, well, we have to be able to work with those things simultaneously as we go forward, right? I'm going to stop here because I want to hear from you, and I've spoken far too long.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you for that the remarks. But it raises for me a whole lot of questions. Top of mind is, where do we go from here? We see all the friction lines emerging across the country. We see a state which I've always thought to destroy value. What I've now learned is actually eating itself. How do we build a state out of all of these seemingly intractable problems?
All right, well, let me take a crack and then open it up, because I'd love to hear from you all. And that is, the first thing is, two things I would say. Don't assume that there'll be some master plan that's going to be put together to deal with all of this. Nigeria is a very complex place with very complex issues, right? And we've spent a lot of time with a political bureau and a national conference and all of that, and putting in a lot of time and effort. That I wouldn't recommend, quite frankly, going in that direction. The second thing is that it's so important to be able to address the various parts of these entities, right, that are really relevant to you. So as many of you, in terms of your work, whether it has to do with procurement or statistics or the central bank or so on, there will be particular aspects of that edifice that are of real importance to you, and who can contribute to that, both from within, from outside, and so on. That's one aspect I'm going to, just mention about. The other important aspect, in terms of Nigeria, and here I must, Rotimi Subaru was mentioned, and I can't wait for, I have in mind something I want to do here, and I can't wait to bring Egosa and Rotimi and Wale and all of them in the room, together with others that I know of, so we could really have, some of the people who do the best critical kind of thinking on this. Rotimi Subaru has really convinced me of the importance of an incrementalist approach to addressing the issues in Nigeria. And it's something, and it's, and you're going to be hearing from me on this, on this subject as part of, I'm contributing to debate, and I'm just giving you my sort of 2 cents worth in that debate. And the idea with an, because, for example, we were just on a radio show this morning, it's supposed to be 15 minutes, and it went out for like 40 minutes. And they were asking me about restructuring, right? And, there was this big word, restructuring. And, so again, restructuring, you're coming, we got to take this down, we got to move this apart, we got to put this piece and so on. But I'm going to begin to suggest improving, first of all, right? And improving for a number of reasons. One, this is not, and you're aware, today in 2017, we have had the longest continuous period of constitutional government in Nigeria since Nigeria's independence. 3 times longer than that period. First of all, the second thing is that, Rotimi identifies, there have been a number of advances that have been made. Not some involving, constitutional, committee and acts and so on, like electoral commission and so on. But a lot of it involving legislative action, right? Improvements. The whole issue, the major issue about so many resources coming to the center, things being congested. But it has been, decentralizing in a number of areas. And even sometimes it's not the answer, because you can decentralize, provide more funds to a particular area, all right, the revenue generating, areas, and then you have to set up organizations to make use of those funds. Now, how do those organizations function? Do those functions, because they have more money, are they functioning any better than so on? And then the last thing I'll put on that score in terms of the incrementalism is that the National Conference in 2014, as you all know, it had almost 500 people, participants, went on for months, heaven knows how much that cost. And it came up with this huge amount of big reports and recommendations and so on. But if we looked on the issue that really surprised me, having to do with the geopolitical zones, because Nigerians have become comfortable now referring to geopolitical zones. It has no constitutional basis. It is something that has emerged like many things in Nigerian life. But what did that conference do when it came to consider the geopolitical zones as a possible framework for a new tier of government? They decisively rejected it, right? So it's just giving you a sense of the what is involved in trying to move in that direction. But
interesting. And we'll open it up for comments in a little minute. I don't know if you're writing a new book. And,
a book will come, yes.
Yeah.
I've been promising for a long time. That's why I'm doing this collection of my writings first, and so on. But I promise you a book is coming.
Yeah, because I found something in your writing where you talked about something like the 5 tenets: democracy, building social wealth, right? GATE, which is an acronym, invent, and state configuration. And I wondered if you could use that framework to talk a little bit about Nigeria and where we can go from here on.
All right. Well, I'm letting you know that we're doing it in stages. First, we're going to have this volume becoming available. I created Africa Plus with the assistance of my student assistants, and also we're going to be making those available. There's a lot of writings here on Nigeria. I'm also going to be doing another volume, again because I've got research assistants now working with me. Is I'm going to be pulling together a set of my thematic papers, right, and a lot of those subjects. So, issues, all the core issues, state governance, democracy, development, and so on. That we will have a volume that we're going to be working on that, following the Nigeria volume. So, it's all coming, right? I could assure you.
Okay, excellent. We'll open it up, but whilst we were talking, 2 other gentlemen walked in. Lai Yahaya, Special Advisor to the Senate President, and Joe Abba, Director General, Bureau of Public Service Reform.
All right.
So let's open it up for questions and comments.
As you were talking, I kept reflecting on how this actually trickles down to even the state level. This ethnic capture, this geopolitical sense of it. What amazes me about the federal level discussion is that you could go down to my state and the questions are pretty much the same. Which part are you from? Which local government are you from? So is there a thought that maybe part of this improvement is even drilling down to the state level to say, who are we really in our state, and what do we, even at the state level, this discussion is happening. You won't get certain access if you're not from a certain part of the state, depending on, you know, and the sensing of capture of institutions that are captured by a particular ethnic group within the state. So it's almost like a microcosm of what is happening at the federal level, and I'm sure it's the same for many other people from different parts of the country as well. And I just wanted to see if there are thoughts on even how much lower this goes than just the federal that gets all the attention.
The bits of your talk that I caught raises a number of issues in my mind, and that also relates to the last comment as well. You see, I agree with you about incremental change. I mean, it's what I do. I do public service reforms, not public service revolution or reform. So it's incremental. So I agree with that. However, if the basis of the incrementalism is faulty, then you have a problem. And that's why, yes, I agree that we shouldn't focus too much on national discourses and all of that, but I really, really think we need to rethink the fundamentals that hold us together. So the constitution that we have, and I don't mean that in terms of anything else other than this, you know, this entitlement and representation and sharing formula. You see, the constitution we have is based on sharing. That's what it's based on. And that's why everything that constitution does talks about who gets what. You know, even the state commissions that it sets up talks about how, you know, various representatives must come from various places. It talks about how the president must appoint a minister from each of the states, whether he likes it or not, and whether he needs it or not. And so you have an ethos of sharing. By the way, it doesn't emphasize production at all. It just emphasizes consumption. And so you come into public office representing a part of society. Okay, so we even have the bureaucracy now, the civil service, permanent secretaries representing states that they come from. So you have this dichotomy where, as a civil servant, you're supposed to rise through the system, and the best gets to be permanent secretary. Well, we don't have that. That also has been politicized. So now the permanent secretary represents a state. So the whole idea is about sharing and equity and all of those things. And it is exactly the same thinking that goes down to state level as well. It's exactly the same thinking. Many people think there's this huge gulf between federal and state. There isn't, actually. You know, whatever the federal does is what the states mirror. You hardly get a state that moves away from what the federal does in terms of how it approaches representation or how it approaches equity. So I really, really think there's a need to have a discussion about the constitution that holds us together. And that discussion should include what is our idea of statehood? What do we believe a state should do? Because you'll be surprised to know that there's very wide disagreement among Nigerians about what the state should do. Some believe state should provide everything. I mean, why not? We have oil. Why should we need to work? The money comes out of the ground. Why should I pay taxes to a state that doesn't do A, B, C, D, E? You know all the arguments. But, you know, so I think there's that need to have a discussion. What kind of state do we want? Do we want, is our theory of state minimalist? Is it socialist? Is it developmental? What is it? What do we believe as a people? And what kind of states do we then create to deliver what it is we believe as a people? I think unless we have that discussion, to be honest, we will run around in circles.
The first point is sharing and representation. Right? And representation in the sense of diversity in our own systems. You know, we have to have women, we have to have African Americans, we're going to have Asians, and so on. So the idea that when you have a multi-ethnic community, diversities and so on, being representation, and Nigeria came up with federal character. In itself, there's nothing wrong with that because it's part of it. But the other thing when you mention of what kind of state, I mean, there is, and again, Rotimi really helps us see this. Talking about the fact of the military, the role of the military, right? And that the state creation exercises, all of those state creation exercises were under the military, right? And these two things going together, Nigeria becoming dependent on petroleum and the military being in that position for that period of time. Those two things have been really shaping elements that you're still struggling with, even as you move in. So I just want to mention, that one issue there. Hold on a second, let me see. The issue that when you're saying about, another thing that Rotimi says is, so what kind of a state have we ended up? He said that the central government serves principally as an arena for the ethno-political sharing of the resources. I mean, this has just emerged as a process. And I think, so the issue that you're raising is something to be really confronted, but confronted in the sense of how these things have been shaped historically by some forces, right? And therefore, how to be able to address it. And in addressing it, again, and this is my final point, is incremental where incrementalism is called for. Where fundamental changes, if we take the INEC, I mean, there are some fundamental changes in terms of the Electoral Act and so on, some fundamental changes in terms of the funding and so on, autonomy, that has made that possible. So it's possible to have both incrementalism and fundamental changes. The only thing I'm arguing for is not to go overboard when you're using restructuring, right? Without recognizing that there are a lot of positive gains to be made through an incremental improvement approach.
I agree with that. Sorry, I agree with that, and it's not just INEC. There are very many. I mean, we've got NAFDAC, for instance, that has moved from having, Nigeria has gone from 41% prevalence of fake drugs in the year 2000 to 6% today,
right.
and that's beyond all the arguments about leadership and all that, and it's Orakwili. Well, when the Orakwili left, it was at 11%. So somehow it has continued to improve since then. We have the Federal Inland Revenue Service. There was again some fundamental changes, but it has survived. If we're Komogui, who drove it, and continues to improve. Apart from the recent experience we had with the recession and the fall in oil prices, that has affected their results. There are many like that I could mention. There's the postal service, for instance, and not many people realize that in Nigeria you can still post a letter and it will be delivered to you without knowing anyone, just putting a stamp on it. If you haven't tried it before, please do. So there are things that work. There are things that have survived. There are things that... Frank is laughing. Apart from the post office. So there are things that work, and there are things that have survived. There are things that have had both fundamental and incremental change. That's all correct. There's no problem with that. My problem is, like I said, we don't have a clear view, A, of the kind of state we want, and B, of the sacrifices we need to make to get that kind of state that we want. That is our fundamental problem, in my view. And until we have that discussion, we will keep having islands of excellence, like INEC and NAFDAC and a few others. We'll continue having the Drug Law Enforcement Agency is another one, reputed to be the most effective in Africa. And it does it with little or no money from government. So there are very many others. But we will keep having these islands of excellence until we address the fundamental issues. I agree we don't need to go overboard with the the whole restructuring and let's tear it down and start again.
Sure.
But we need to, maybe like the Americans did, sit down and agree a Bill of Rights as an example. You know, these are the Bill of Rights. These are the things that we're going to be guided by. That's the discussion we need to have.
Yeah, to everyone who has spoken. I think some very, very important points have been raised. And I want to say very clearly that with respect to the Nigerian state, I'm in favor of one entity called Nigeria. And I want to say something, and that is to the effect that, or rather to say to you that I'd like to get your views on the matter of the role of governance and leadership in the state of affairs in Nigeria. And I say this for the very simple fact that in spite of the seeming advantages that various ethnic groups appear to have maybe planned to get by reason of certain people being in certain positions, I want to submit respectfully that there's no part of Nigeria today that you can actually say is so much better than the other part of the country. Educationally, whether you're talking about healthcare, whether you're talking about whatever you're talking about, poverty issues, there's no state really. When you look at it in a general sense, from the perspective of well-being and progress of the people of Nigeria, in spite of what the military may have done with northern Nigeria, in spite of what anyone else may have done with other parts of the country with revenue sharing and that. So how come that over 30 years or 40 years of, say, revenue sharing advantages to certain parts of the country, poverty remains endemic in those areas? So I'm making a case that really, I'm not so sure that it's about the significant differences amongst the ethnic groups, but more about our inability to govern ourselves and the poor quality of leadership in all of these, through the years. That is really my own thing. It's not about. I'm sure that most people will agree that I was born in Kano, for instance. I spent most of my schooling career in northern Nigeria, in Maiduguri, for instance, in Yola, for instance. Some of my childhood friends, my best friends, are northerners or people of diverse backgrounds. I went to a so-called Unity College, where children were brought from different parts of the country and put together in their formative years, and that today we remain friends. And so I do not understand, for instance, the circumstances under which I would take up arms or plan any kind of harm or evil against people from a particular part of the country, because my mindset was not so constructed. And I believe that you can say the same for most peoples of our country. The problem usually arises from the political elite, and only when it is convenient. When it is convenient, that is when these issues have often arisen, in my own view. So I believe that if it was possible to really have more people who have a global worldview and who have a pan-Nigerian worldview to really think some of these issues through, we can create a fair and just society, which might actually be the foundation for the kind of conversation that my brother here is talking about.
Excellent. And I agree. But two quick things I wanted to say to those, really actually long points. And the first one was, going back to the presentation that Egosa Osagi made just about a little over a month ago in Chicago on the question of ethnicity. And then he was talking about the extent to which, how many Nigerians, especially professionals like yourselves here, function in trans-ethnic arenas, right? And so in those arenas, people are adopting ways of thinking, ways of sharing, partnerships and so on, that are really crossing those lines. And it's also happening within families in terms of intermarriage and so on. So there's a whole process by which a Nigeria, is emerging and has been moving on. The last point, and it connects with the first question about down to the local level. And, saying, but, the things you're talking about, you have it, down at local level. And you're also saying, if you look all over Nigeria, you're seeing it. And I'll say two specific things. A good friend of mine, Professor Sani Umar, who is back here in Nigeria, and he was at Northwestern for a time with me. And I was asking him a question he had done a paper for this conference we had, on prebendalism. And I was asking, given you have these structures in the north, these traditional structures in the north, and given you have these cultural differences and so on, and then you had funds going into local government areas and so on, I'm saying why it is the performance has been, not better. I mean, it seems to me, and he said to me that, very straightforward, Richard, the sort of things you were talking about in your book, it's the same sort of thing that's operating in these areas, all right? So there is some positive dimension to what's sharing, but there's also a negative dimension in terms of that same kind of sharing of attributes and so on.
Professor Derek.
Richard, I see. Did I understand you to say that Rotimi does not support restructuring in your conversations?
All right, all right, quickly. Rotimi would say these, attitudes that in order for Nigeria to progress, you need to have this big overall of the system. But he would agree with the conversation that took place here, namely about the, where transformations are necessary, fundamental ones, and but I would say he would tend to be on the side of looking for incremental approaches because he feels there is just so much to be done and also so much has been done.
Well, incrementalism at the level of the institutions. But you see, the restructuring argument is about decentralization of power. And it's about decentralization of power. It keeps telling me to speak loud. Yes, I can go. Well, it's about decentralization because it is the extreme level of centralization of power that is making for very fierce politics in Nigeria. That is itself, in of itself, contributory to this huge corruption that we have in the country. There are so many things that are put at the center which can be done comfortably at the state levels. You don't have to come here to the federal government to get driving license, for instance. There are so many things, just like in the United States, that are done at the state level very comfortably. And the same Nigerians who do them here at the center are also resident at the state levels and able to do this. And so that's one of the calls. I think that the issue of restructuring is going to play a predominant part in the next election. And I think that it will be very important to start thinking about it now. Because if you just say it's something that is best suited through the approach of incremental politics, some people are going to see it as dodging the question. And I think that I don't buy into that at all. I personally think that the country has to consider seriously the reduction of the level of power at the center.
Thank you very much, Professor Joseph. It's always a grand pleasure to be in your company, and you haven't disappointed. I want to make my comments following quickly on the comments made by the two immediate past speakers. First of all, I want to be clear myself that a functioning, capable Nigerian state, like Dr. Abba is working hard to produce, will be the best for everybody in this geographical space. But there are questions I want to raise at the end of the few comments I want to make to put those questions in context. Just 3 statements within the past 1 month in Nigeria. One of the statements was the acting president gifting Lagos on its 50th birthday the right to reconstruct the Lagos Airport Road within Lagos. And this was the major announcement of his trip to Lagos.
This is to reconstruct what roads are?
The Lagos Airport Road within Lagos. So the federal government has given this gift that you can now spend money and build a road within Lagos. Giving you the authority as a gift. And that's just one example. Another example is the Constitution of Nigeria makes it quite clear that the governors are the chief security authorities within their states. They are responsible for the security of life and property of everybody resident in the state. Within the past few days, two governors have actually requested, not the acting president, but requested the president to rein in the activities of Mieti Allah, one of the two cattle rearing associations in Nigeria, to really bring them under control. Because the governors have given up, they have exhausted their constitutional authority to be able to provide for coexistence between the itinerant farmers, herdsmen, and their local settled communities. And the third example I want to give is an announcement that was made the day before yesterday by some youth organizations in the north, giving a deadline for people from eastern Nigeria to pack out of the north. Such announcements are made in virtually every country. You have cranks from every part of, every country making announcements, and whether or not they register on the political Richter scale says a lot about the character of the states in which those extreme elements reside. In Germany you have the far right, in the UK you have the English Democratic League, and all sorts of, in America you have the KKK and all sorts of extremists. And they make announcements every day, but whether or not those announcements register shows you the ability or the confidence of that state to withstand the extreme elements. So what I'm actually trying to come to is, you did some work previously about not just the nature of the African state, but something which is more fundamental, the formation of the African state, which historically has been different from the formation of, for example, European states. If you look at the formation of the modern states of Germany, Italy, and especially the funny spaces between the big powers, where you have Luxembourg and Belgium and all of that, all of those have been forged in battle. So in terms of African countries being formed out of the Westphalia treaties and people drawing lines on empty maps, that I think is a significant explanation for the dysfunction of African states. And you mentioned in some of your examinations that I don't know if it was serious or not, but that if African nations were allowed to compete against each other for territory in the formation of the modern African state, we may probably have a different Africa today. So the reason I mention this is I actually agree with the former editor of the New Nigerian, who says that Nigeria is a cultural federation. And Professor George Obiozo will say that Nigeria is a space for the context of ethnic nationalities. And in fact, the idea of distribution based on the ethno-political factions or subunits or even business units is the essential fact of the Nigerian state. And a colleague of yours, Richard Sklar, actually goes to ask the questions about mixed government. And the mixed government is actually the fundamental challenge to the modern Nigerian state, because a state should have universal authority within the geographical entity. And that universal authority has to be based on openly known rules of law. So you need to know what the rules are within the entire space. But what we have is we have multiple levels of government, which are then broken into these conglomerates, all trying to access different levels of the same thing that we tend to call the Nigerian state, which may or may not exist in reality. I give you the example of the past governor of the central bank, who is now an emir, who obviously with some authority, but his authority came into conflict with the authority of some of those conglomerates who expressed their power through the governor of the state of Kano. And the resolution of that crisis actually tells you quite a lot more about the construction and the nature of the Nigerian state than just, reading the announcements of one governor, one minister, or the other, because those people are not really as significant in the fate and in the direction of travel of the Nigerian state. Therefore, what Professor Mudiwe has said about restructuring being something that should, I don't know if you said it must, but should become part of the next electoral cycle, is something that I think most sane Nigerians would want to subscribe to, because essentially conflict comes where there is a breakdown in the means of resolving the contradictions within society. Usually, components in society will compete with ideas, with performance, and that competition can be expressed through political groupings. For example, after the Second World War, the British people decided to go for a Labour government because they wanted to rebuild, they wanted consolidation, they wanted to provide healthcare, they wanted to provide public housing, and they went for that. But after the dysfunction of the early 70s, they decided that the British state was no longer working, and they went for the conservatives. They wanted a shareholding democracy, they wanted efficiency, they wanted to drive out lethargy in the publicly held institutions, and that was how Margaret Thatcher came in. And those type of transitions seem to be effortless. But actually, if you have ever stood and watched a political campaign in a village, and I live in a British village, there are actually very, very heated sessions, but you can see that there is an avenue for a real competition in those ideas. And the problem with Nigeria is that the military have imposed a unitary system here which has not shared those spoils in the minds of many in Nigeria fairly, and so Nigeria is now a federation of disgruntled nationalities. Everybody is angry with everybody, and people where I come from the East, they think the North is just angry with the East. No, I go to the North, and the North is angry with the North, and the East is angry with the North, and the West is angry with everybody. It's a federation of disgruntled nationalities, and this disgruntlement has to be negotiated in a forum, and that forum has to be a forum that allows for some reconstruction of the edifice that has been put in place by the 1999 Constitution. And as most of us know, the first line of that Constitution was obviously a lie. It was not we, the people of Nigeria, having come together to give ourselves this Constitution. That's a bad lie. So the people of Nigeria have to come together to create a type of state where if you are born a girl in Kebbi State, you have a chance at a decent life. If you are a trader in Aba, you have a chance at actually making it and becoming somebody that can market your goods worldwide. And if you are a cocoa farmer, you have a right to actually access the cocoa markets and make money doing it. The way Nigeria is set up today, those three people I've given as example are frustrated. And their frustration is just a microcosm of the bigger story, which obviously is being hijacked by the elite. But the way you prevent the hijacking of the elite is to support some kind of conversation that brings the demos forward to the public space. The people have to come to the public space and find a way to negotiate their future. And that's how you build a resilient and I think a state that we can then begin to talk of whether it can perform or not.
Excellent. Let's take Ian.
Quickly. The first is, so to my mind, there's one other ingredient around this conversation that hasn't been touched on much, and that is how identity of the individual Nigerian is constructed, and how that determines that individual's relationship with the state. As is presently available, what you find is every Nigerian is hardly an individual when he relates with the state, or she relates with the state. Every Nigerian is a representative of some group. Now, in that sense, then, my question would be, and the backdrop of that is, I'm sure you're very familiar with Mahmoud Mamdani's work on the citizen and the state, and his thesis about the misshapen approach to emerge or to build an ethnic state in Africa, predicated on a presumption that ethnic belonging and state building are two mutually exclusive constructs that cannot safely occupy the same space. Therefore, if you're building a state, you would have to think very carefully as to how ethnicity is handled and it's brought to bear. In Nigeria's case, ethnicity is used as ethnicity as well as religion or identity generally is used as a basis to identify who the Nigerian citizen is. In order to do that, you have to identify another level of belonging. So between the Nigerian individual called the Nigerian citizen and the Nigerian state is another group belonging that serves as an interlocutor, which is basically the platform for prebendalism to exist, for the rent state to be able to express itself fully. So my question to you in that respect is, on the back of what you said with an incremental approach, is it possible that within the same mold I think should be broken, you can have an incremental approach to breaking that mold? Mamdani suggests that what we need is collective action, and we need to be able to identify a specific juncture and address very fundamental institutional challenges, not incrementally, but very decisively at a point in history. And I wanted your thoughts on that, and if you think that they are contradictory or there is space for us to be able to have both approaches in the case, in Nigeria's case, in order to move forward.
Sorry, I'm walking a bit late. I had to stop at work. I feel like something that we have also not really done, is a bit of what Daniel said, is that we haven't taken up this ownership mentality of the country. It's not basically just about creating programs or solutions, is how do we own the process. I have read a lot of theoretical papers about sustaining states in emerging democracies, and I've come to understand that the causal relationship between development and democracy is still quite inconclusive, analyzing it. But also, being able to consolidate democracy is a process that we haven't taken up as a country. And how do I marry this with ownership is that we need to come to a place where we have built a political culture where all the main players, all the main actors, forces of interest, institutions come to see democracy as the only game in town, and come to own it and understand that everybody needs to be involved, not just the elites. It has to be the ground people, it has to be the civil actors, it has to be the institutions. And then how do we sustain this? Because most times we come up with a lot of forums where we talk about solutions, and a lot of people, agencies, we start these things. We have grants and we start it. For example, we have an institution like Yaga that has been pushing the Not Too Young to Run campaign. And as beautiful as it is, I feel like there might be no sustainable structure that after this fight is done, are there still going to be people that will pick up from where they have stopped? Are there still going to be generations where what our game plan here, are we going to put up a plan where some other people will pick up from where we have stopped? For example, let me use aid work from agencies. Agencies come up with grants to help states be able to transit from a certain stage to another, and then they set up this work, and after it's done, they leave. But there's no ownership mentality from the communities to continue this work, this program, and understand that this is for us. We have to continue. And then after the set of fighters have come and gone, there are no people to pick up the reins to say, you see what, this was something good that started. How do we continue in it? So we have a country of new ideas, new projects, new programs everywhere, but nothing to sustain it. So my question is, how do we sustain this, and how do we own the process of it?
Thank you. I have quite a number of pilots. And they tell me that...
pilots and planes?
Yes,
okay.
And they tell me that training, the first rule in their training is when you miss your flight, you miss your course. You miss your course, you miss your route or whatever. You must return to where you're coming from. That's the first rule in aviation. When you miss your course, you return. You turn around and go back to where you're coming from. The first rule in aviation. I mean,
I think the consensus really, even from discussions here, that we missed our course as a nation. I mean, maybe stemming from the coup of 1966. The regions were, developing our power. How we bring a television station and Zik and the other child to the south. It's okay, we need a television station as well. And now the people was okay, we need a television station as well. There was what we call healthy rivalry between the regions until, of course, the coup and the subsequent unitary system. I mean, for most of us, there is a consensus of sorts that, look, if we don't restructure, if we don't go back, we may never get it. Nigeria, I tell you today, is glued by one thing. The only glue that is putting us together is the oil in the Niger Delta. That is it. That is the only thing that is holding us together. I don't want to go into... So, probably, I was really disturbed. That was, I needed to make this clarification. You seemingly, even if so slightly, opposed to restructuring, the concept of restructuring. I mean,
I'm going to come back to speak.
Yeah, I really want you to touch that, because this is it's a touchy thing for some of us.
Sure.
How do we miss our course? Yes. How do we come back?
Okay. More questions.
Can I just say a few things, and then I'll go, because I think there's just a lot of very interesting ideas on the table here. And I'll have to tell you that, when I get to Lagos, later today, inshallah, I will get to my hotel and I will spend some time putting some of these ideas together for my presentation tomorrow. So this is very helpful, and a lot of the conversations are really centered on this. All right. So let me just say just a couple of things, just adding to all the interesting ideas that have been put forward. I remember when we had the conference in 2011, the one that Adebanwi and Obadere organized around the whole prebendalism and so on. And I remember Dr. Kayode Fayemi, in one of his addresses, talked that we have to rethink I'm paraphrasing his words, the basis of our togetherness, right? And it's the same thing that I'm hearing, over and over again in different ways here. We were in a discussion earlier, yesterday, on this issue of the tiers of government, right? Federal, state, and local government. And when you look at the allocation of responsibilities, you look at allocation of revenues at those levels, obviously it's awry. I mean, it just just on the level of what's there. That needs first forward. Great. The question, though, is how do you deal with... I'm just dealing with that one particular aspect of it. And somebody I was speaking to then talked about the governor in Kaduna State, Al-Rufai, and how the actions that he has taken to ensure funds going down to the local level. Because that's been one of the problems, all right? That they put the local governments under the states. And that's been a real... So there's parts of the constitutional architecture of Nigeria, and a number of them you could recognize, that was not well thought out. And the implications, right? And there's no question of being able to identify what that is. And there's a lot of work has been done. The civil society group came up with it and so on, being able to distill that, right? The reason why I'm really hesitating, and I guess feeling just a little nervous about the notion of restructuring, I guess for various reasons. I taught two courses that I just finished teaching. One was on democracy, autocracy, and disorder. And the other one was a new course entitled Governing Fractured Nations. And I will be going back and looking at a lot of the fundamental writings and thinking about nationalities and federal systems and so on, because obviously I have to get back into, wrestling with thinking about this. And the only reason I sort of hesitate, I sort of pull back a little bit when I say restructuring, we got to restructure, is, the extent that could, and I'm sorry if I'm going to repeat what I said earlier, is not, first of all, recognizing some of the gains that have been made, very significant gains that have been made even since 1999 in some of those areas, okay? And the second reason is, and the question has come up in a couple of times, in my interview yesterday, the talk about restructuring immediately verges to say, well, how do you feel about Biafra? Let me just stop here. But one last thing, I remember right after the conference that we had last year, and what's the name of the former Nigerian Secretary General of the Commonwealth? What? Anaka. Okay. All right. So he came through very strongly, and as we were coming down from the podium, I said to him, I'd like to have to see a debate between you and Rotimi Subaru, right? Because the idea, and that he is now very prominent, and he says that Nigeria is not going to be able to deal adequately with the problems it has if we don't go back to that system that we had, right? And and so my sense was, let's put it this way: you can go back and find yourself back in some problems.
Yeah.
So I'm more about how do we go forward.
What I want to add to that is we are sort of at a position that the US was once in its history when it had to go from confederation to federation, because it saw that confederation was not going to make the state vote, was introducing a lot of problems. So it really called the Constitutional Conference that created a federation. Our situation is like that now. What we have now is not sustainable. And what will help the country is to rethink it. We are not saying to destroy it. We are saying to manage it by identifying what the problem is, which is over-centralization and disempowering the units of the federation, the states. And so what we want to do is bring back competition so that the states will become less dependent at the center.
Excellent.
Let's
go to Madaki.
Which I see from my own angle is one, exclusion. For a country as big as Nigeria with diverse ethnic groups, you have the problem of exclusion, and the second part becomes strengthening institutions. So from exclusion, you have the situation where you speak about federal character, and then you hear about recruitment problems with the DSS, or you hear about Nextier saying $21 billion hasn't been remitted. Now what Nextier would do is advise the NNPC and advise the government to follow up with this. With federal character, where there's exclusion, the Federal Character Commission can only advise the government, advise the organization, or in the worst case scenario, sue that organization to court. All of this shows weakness. So where Nextier has discovered this and said this is the problem, the only thing they can do is advise. With exclusion, the only thing the people who have been instituted to look out for this can do is advise. So as long as we don't strengthen certain institutions, we will continue to have the same problems. And in this same way, it has the ripple effect which goes down to the state level and also the local government level. So we have our solution is also our problem. We have this, but unless we strengthen these organizations, nothing.
Economic dynamics of the 60s is not the economic dynamics of today. So for the oil revenues of the South to be the basis on which we would sit down to discuss the issues of us being together as a nation, we are still missing the point. In fact, that should not even be the question now. If ethnicity and cultures are what is defining our states, the state of the nation, but then cultures are not commandments. We can choose to ignore them as we may. For my generation, I don't think the issue of culture arises more often. Our issue is Nigeria must just work. If it is not Nigeria working, if it is Biafra working, let it work. If it is not Biafra that is working, it is Boko Haram that is working, let it work. The issue at the bottom is youth are not just angry, they are willing to take up the helms of affairs by themselves. So saying we should go back is not going to solve the problem. We should sit down and look ahead, not just in 2019, 2022. We should sit down and look ahead 50 years from today. The economy has changed. Technology is moving very well, and we're still speaking about oil. It's unfortunate.
Just a quick clarification for the benefit of the Prof. I think the very loud word restructuring, I think I need to explain what is meant by the people that I know who talk about it. Restructuring is being understood in the context of devolution of powers and subsidiarity. So you do at the local level those things that are best done at the local level. There is no point having a bureaucrat in Abuja designing the curriculum of schools in various parts of Nigeria. There is no point having somebody here in Abuja insisting on the shape and nature of things that are best left at the local level. There are parts of this country that can combine, for example, local medicine with modern medicine. But the federal government will insist that every clinic, they will build 1,000 clinics and they will all look the same, even though the health challenges in different parts of Nigeria. So, what's the word again? Restructuring is meant to be a planned, controlled process of devolving some powers that are not necessary at the center to the periphery. And the aim of doing that is to prevent a cataclysmic, unplanned reorganization.
Yes, that is possible.
That is possible.
Yes, there's something I'm not very clear on yet. So restructuring, however we are talking about it, is changing the structure of Nigeria. So the way I'm looking at it is we have people in this building. Let's say it's a 3-story building. And then we have a different kind of building, a 1-story or a 2-story, and then we move the same set of people into that other building. Is it going to change some of our fundamental problems? Let me give an example. There was someone that said once that if you take out the current crop of leaders in Nigeria, just take all of them out, put them on the streets, then pick out the same number of people from the streets of Nigeria and put them in those same positions, we'll have the exact same thing going on. So if there's a fundamental problem with the orientation of Nigerians, which one now comes first? Is it changing Nigerians or changing the structure? Because something needs to change about the way we see ourselves, like the identity problem that somebody was speaking about. So it's like chicken and egg, which comes first? Is it changing the structure or even making sure that the people that you're carrying into that new structure would be able to make it work? That's the question that I have.
And for as long as I can remember, the sort of discussions and ideas resonating in this room has been the same, go back to the drawing board, and I'm worried that someday, the next couple of years, my children are going to sit around the table like this and still discussing it with no tangible outcome. So my question is this: what is the role of education in all of this? Is there a way we can use education as a tool to begin to change the orientation, the mindset of people, of Nigerians around state building? And when I talk about education, I mean children from primary school level. So that's my question.
Federal School, Federal Government College, Kaduna. And I think that there's an orientation, you go through 6 years of that education. You have people from different parts of the country and you start to understand, you understand other cultures, and I can see myself sitting with, say, people from my hometown who've never been outside there, the way what their orientation is versus somebody who has had a similar orientation to mine. And that's why, in the last election, in the lead up to the last election, when there were discussions around things like Muslim tickets, and it comes back to something Sarah said earlier, is if that's going to make Nigeria work, then so be it, right? But unfortunately, we have a balancing system, and I've spent some time, of course, in the US, so the whole notion of, in quotes, affirmative action, which is what we term federal character here, which is representation from different groups, ends up being, some would say, a race to the bottom, because it's not as if you pick the best from each of those groups. So there's an orientation aspect of it that comes from the educational system. We've, I think in the last couple of years, lamented the loss of history. We don't teach history anymore. And I think there's a component of that that comes into play. Because you learn lessons from the past, and of course, if you change the mindset, or if you work on the mindset, maybe there might be a different approach to the way Nigeria tends to function. And it comes down, I was intrigued by the notion of Nigeria being on paper we're a formal federation, but I think I see the concept of a cultural federation as something that seems to work in the background.
If I get time, I'll write an article about state organizations as the supra-state, because you get organizations like NNPC who basically ignore the state. They're outside the powers of the state. I mean, not many people know that the NNPC spends more recurrent budget than the federal government itself. I think as does the central bank, actually. Our central bank is perhaps the only central bank in the world that duplicates the functions of the state and, of job creation agencies, and does it with impunity, and nobody can do anything about it. So, when we talk about the need to discuss, we're not saying tear everything down, balkanize or fragment Nigeria. No, let's just have a discussion. That's what we're asking for. Do we need local governments or not? Let's just have that discussion. Should we stop pretending that there are 3 tiers of government? Because in actuality, there isn't. Should we just stop pretending and say, okay, local government chairmanship position becomes appointive? Open it up, every Nigerian can apply. If you get the job, just like it's done in the UK and elsewhere, if you get the job, you run the local government for a tenure. Or, should we get rid of state governance and do like what the UK does, which is have central and local? There's no state. We must have these discussions. If we don't, we're simply incrementally struggling with something we haven't fully discussed and agreed with. Because even look at some of the issues that have been raised. Do we need a bicameral legislature or not? Do we need them to be full-time or not? A lot of these issues were raised in the national conference. If we had a means through which we could have a referendum where Nigerians choose, for good or for bad, Nigerians choose. On this particular question, this is what we want.
Thanks, sir. I'll go to Nana, maybe, Honorable Minister.
Thank you very much. I just want to provide, I want to pick your brain on leveraging on what my brother Joe said. Whether we will accept it or not, we need that conversation to agree on the kind of state structure that we want to move us from point A to point B. But the real challenge is the how to. Because if you go through Twitter, read articles, there is a lot of what to. But the real challenge will come down to the how to. So, Prof, from your experience in this space, you know Nigeria quite a lot. How can we achieve that conversation and deliver the results? I was also part of the conference. My brother Frank will say a bit more about it. And at some point during the conference, this question of how to confronted us. How do we ensure that the decisions out of the conference are implemented? And the subject of referendum came up. I wasn't a delegate, I was managing the back room. So how do what kind of advice are we going to give to government to ensure that the outcomes are implemented? And the referendum option came. And we put together a team of senior advocates of Nigeria, about 5 of them, professors of law and all that. And the first thing that confronted us was that the constitution of Nigeria as it is now forbids a referendum. That was the first thing that they told us. That it's only in the cases of boundary adjustment and recall of assembly members that you can trigger a referendum. But we also tried to then be innovative and came up with a chapter 6, which never made it to the report, which we called Exercise of People's Sovereignty. And it was meant to be a memo straight to the president to say, this is an innovative way to call a referendum outside of the constitution. Unfortunately, all those were submitted to him prior to the election, and they decided not to do anything with it and face the election. So, but Prof, I still will want to hear from you. In the midst of all of this, how can we get a discussion or a conversation that will deliver outcomes that we can implement? Because it is within that all of these questions whether restructuring means the evolution of powers, or whether some people think it means regionalism and all of that. We can then agree on what state we want and begin to create that state.
On this issue, and in fact, I have a lot of work waiting for me to do going back into this. I've mentioned one thing. I came across this volume in my collection, and right now I'm really, working on my archives, and I'm also working on my book collection. I'm really thinking of a resource center that to make these things available. But I came across a volume that I haven't seen in many years, and it's from a conference that was held also at the Institute of Administration in Zaria in November of 1972. And the title, if I have it correctly, was Nigeria in Search of a Viable Polity. And I flipped through that, and it was very interesting to see Alison, Aida, and all of those individuals from that period debating these issues, but what kind of things. I even turned to the page, and having, Shehu Yar'Adua and others in there. I think it was Yar'Adua who came forward that, well, what Nigeria really needs to do is to move towards the American type system with an executive president and so on, right? So, the point I'm making, all right, so that's 35 years ago. All right. Over the past, and I was thinking of what was going to happen in the military. I mean, the military, and they were looking at 76. They were expecting Gowon would keep his promise, which he didn't. But we have, over that period, an extraordinary amount of discussion and debate that has taken place in Nigeria around these questions. Incredible. Probably no country in the world could match Nigeria in terms of how much has been done with the political bureau and the conferences and so on, right? So one of the things that, and in fact, I'm working on it. I told you, restructure makes me nervous, so I understand that. But I'm an incremental, obviously make, my dear brother here, Ibera, feel like I'm dodging. So, and that's Subaru's thing. I'm not speaking, I'm really looking. So I'm going to use the term reform. I think I'm more comfortable with reform because it doesn't presuppose for me, the idea of structure is, is that kind of thing, and that makes me nervous. So, a reform, what is the appropriate state reform strategy for Nigeria? And state reform strategy would mean, there's some things that you have to, you have to take a scalpel to, and you really got to turn around because it just can't work the way it is. And there's some things you have to deal with refinements. That's the only reason in terms of how we think about it. The second thing is that we need to find an effective way of being able to distill some of these best ideas, which means you can't have a national conference that went on and long to do and then reconvene another one of that same nature. This is not a good use of things. So we have to think of a more practical way of being able to just distill some of those things. We could even go back. I'm going to be reading that. I couldn't bring it with me. I had so many books I was bringing with me to read. None of them are going to be taken back unread. But that, one can go back and say, okay, what did these guys say in 1972 when they were raising the issue of a viable polity in Nigeria? And a lot of these thinking, and remember I told you, I was actually present in Zaria for that discussion of the draft constitution. And they were all there, Aminu Kano and Shagari, and everybody was there. Heaven knows how I ended up being there. I only arrived in Nigeria a year ago, but thanks to Bolaji Akiyemi. But, and we can actually now go and see, all right, let's take a little time out now, because our people have been thinking about these issues all along. We have also made some major mistakes, right? We also had a structure, and and don't forget about that. It was and Rotimi warns about that. It was the massive imbalances that we had in that structure, right? That Nigeria came to independence with, that generated a lot of the tensions and so on that contributed to that. We know that, and we can't be unmindful of that. So that is where I will really come down. Not for me now to be able to say this, that, or the other, but really is how do we get to where we would like to be? And there, again, in terms of my thinking and the kind of contribution I can make,
is kind of how we can work on those issues. And let me just end with one thing. About 4 or 5 years ago, I can't remember exactly, I came to a conference put together by an organization, I think it's called the something like the Committee on Federations, and it's based in Canada. I don't know if anybody here was at that meeting. It was here in Abuja, and we had, Osage was there. I remember we had Julius Obere was there. We had very intensive conversations, and this is an organization to which Nigeria belongs in this Committee or Council on Federations. And so they're having this meeting to talk about some of these issues. Well, after we finished our deliberations and we came up with some ideas, they set up a meeting at the National Assembly. And so we came into a National Assembly, and then you had some members coming forward, and I remember sitting there, and then we had, I think it was Egosa, who was now presenting some of the ideas being distilled from our 2 days of discussion. I must tell you, it was been one of the moments of one of my deep dismay, because the assembly representative had no interest. We had spent good days thoroughly presenting it. They were up there, they were joking among themselves, they were not engaging with us. And I was just looking around and thinking to myself, all that went into creating these institutions, and these guys, what are you all thinking? All right, so, bear in mind, this is a meeting that was meant to do exactly what we're talking about. Let us pull together the issues we have here, and you and I took part in this amazing meeting we went to in the UK, and we've had many of those, right? But you can have the greatest meeting in the world. You've got to make sure that the people who have now to act on it, and finally, the National Conference did this incredible work, right? But the National Conference had no authority to act on what it was coming up with. It needed, the bodies and so on to be able to do that. And so again, we really want to think about a reform process that gets us to where we want to do. There's a lot of different parts of that we have to think about.
What I found interesting about quite a lot of the comments, Joe's recent comments, was just the language you were using. So you kept saying, what we are asking for. Right? So I'm thinking, who's we? Yeah. What are you asking? Every time there's a discussion about a national conference, there's a debate about a sovereign national conference. So often it's the authority to act, the authority to make decisions. Every time there's a debate, the debate is only effective when there are rules and there's an umpire. And again, we have this fundamental problem, which is authority to act. Who decides? What are the rules? Who kind of sets the boundaries? If you don't have that, then you only come to conclusions through conflict and competition. The challenge I have is that because we can't somehow agree on who has the authority to act or to convene or to conclude, we end up with this sort of natural tendency towards conflict and competition. Yeah. And it seems that that's the only sort of solution, because we can never decide. Any time there's going to be a national conference or a constitutional review, there has to be somebody who sets the rules of that constitutional review, that conference, and it will never be accepted. Yeah. Because the authority to act, the authority to set the rules will never be accepted. So we end up.
Well, Lloyd, that authority is clear. There's no debate about it. I mean, the National Conference report was submitted to the President. He said he would not read it. He said it clearly that he would not read it.
Why did he convene it?
No.
Different president.
And he would not read it because he was convened at a time when children were not in school. And he was upset by that. Okay. Fine, you're upset by that. Does that invalidate the contents? So it's very, very clear. And when Obasanjo did the one that he did, he said the rules. He said the parameters. When Jonathan did the one he said the parameters as well.
And there was a reason.
PMC and the rest of the
authority to do it. He didn't really
No, he had the authority. He didn't have the will to do it. He had the authority.
Now I wanted to give Arthur Martins a chance to.
Okay, thanks, Prof. It's always great listening to you. We were privileged to meet Development early last year, with Patrick and a number of other people. It's quite gratifying staying among Nigerians who really know what they're talking about. Because, sometimes everybody is an expert on everything, and the media has not helped matters. You listen to the chatter on television, on radio, people go there and spout all kinds of things, restructuring and the rest of them. And you ask them for explanation, they search for answers in their pockets and find none. So the insights that are emerging in terms of these conversations, and you will see the perspectives, and it's coming from deep, thoughtful reflection. Mine is a quick comment. And I know Prof has been bombarded with lots of questions, and if he has the answers to them, he will probably be a billionaire. Comments have been made about restructuring, and I think my brother here has provided, Professor Berry, they have provided quite a lot of insights in terms of, and my brother too. What exactly the notion of restructuring means from their own mind, from their own perspective. There are those who, either deliberately or out of ignorance, try to misrepresent what restructuring means. But for me, however we define restructuring, that is not mutually exclusive with a need for deep value or reorientation in this country. And that's the point that she made so beautifully. Those are not mutually exclusive. Because even if we restructure, like she rightly pointed out, people will still have a certain mindset. They are not mutually exclusive. It's something we have to work, because none can exist outside the other. We need to restructure, but we also need to have this ethical reorientation in terms of having the right values to run our country. Finally, it is important also to not over-romanticize the role of the youth. I've had that over and over again, how somehow the youth are going to change everything. What is the mindset of every Nigerian youth? You can have one or two who are really doing some great work, but the vast majority of them have the same mindset as average Nigerian. And when they take up a few of us a few years ago, we were all youths, and then they had a conference. You and Chudi, you were presented as the youths, for the intergenerational conversation.
Despite the grade.
So a few years ago, we were all youths and the rest of them, And like I said, something has to give in this country. What it is, and you made that point, one of the quotes you read earlier, which is how come we can build mega churches, but we can't fix our roads. The truth of the matter remains that one is about self-appropriation and self-fulfillment. The other one is about the common good. Until we begin to transist from that notion of the self, understanding there are certain things we cannot do for ourselves. So there's a need for commonwealth. I'll give you a story very briefly. A certain people billionaire, this is a true story, bought a Rolls Royce, a brand new Rolls Royce, a few years ago, and he lives in Lagos. I wanted to take it to the east. When you look at the road and the restaurant from Lagos to the east, the Rolls Royce couldn't really do that tremendous road. He had to go and get a special truck, padded with all kinds of foams, and move the Rolls Royce inside, and they had to take it to the east for the Christmas. Luckily for him, because of the foresight of some governors, the roads in the east, in Anambra State, were pretty very good. So he could drive the Rolls Royce around when he got to the village, but he couldn't move it from Lagos to the east. He couldn't go by foot. The point I'm trying to make is until we begin to understand there are things we cannot do for ourselves. We can't have our own roads. We cannot have our own fire service. We cannot have our own police. These are the common things. And it's almost like occupying the finest seats on the deck of the Titanic. If the ship goes down, all of us will go down with that. And that mindset, we have to begin to think about that and change that.
Excellent. Let me give Honorable Minister.
Talking about the national conference, yes, I was there, and it was a very, very robust engagement of very diverse peoples from our country. Now, talking about the difficulty with implementation, and I will explain. The truth of the matter, to my mind, is that the inability or otherwise of various governments to implement the outcomes of these national conversations have had to do with the reason why the conversations were convened in the first place. And so if the outcomes have not appeared or did not appear to fit into the expected outcomes to further a certain agenda, there was some kind of restraint or some kind of resistance to try to say, let's take it forward. And so at the time that President Obasanjo convened that conversation, what was the purpose at the time? And at the time that Jonathan convened the conversation he had in 2014, we had in 2014, what was the purpose? I thought that the speech he gave at the inauguration was one of the best statements I heard from him in his entire presidency. They were so profound. And at the time, I was wondering if there was a clear and full understanding of what he was trying to do. And my mind is that I had doubts that there was a full understanding of that conversation. And no sooner had we gone into that conversation, into the conversations, that it emerged clearly that the people in the room had much deeper understanding of why the conversation should not take place in the way that it was structured. And Nana, who was in the secretariat, would also confirm that there were many times that we came close to just everybody just walking out. There were several hours of downtime. Now, the question is this: under a constitutional democracy such as we have now, which body or who are the people that ought to consider the outcomes of that conversation constitutionally? Constitutionally, as a matter of fact, if the outcomes of the 2014 conversation had been, triggered, say, by the National Assembly, or there was a way for the people of Nigeria to have come together and say, guys, you are our representative, this is what we think, this is what we'd like to do, I believe that they were constitutionally empowered to deal with such issues. But the National Assembly will not want to do such a thing, because to do that would be to then distort the power blocks that were set up, and most of which were to their benefit and for their use. And so there was no incentive for them to do this. Absolutely no incentive. Because to do so, and these were fundamental changes, was going to dislodge them and dislodge their various power bases. So as a matter of fact, my thinking is that in order for any of those, for the resolutions of, say, the 2014 conference to come to light, or to be considered or to be translated to law, or for those changes to happen, either of two things. It's either you have a group of people, either a president who's a statesman in the true sense of the word, and who understands that in order for Nigeria to remain together, you needed to really listen to what the people are saying, and that you cannot coerce anybody to remain together on the terms that currently exist. And then such a president, to my mind, would also have to understand the constitutional role of the National Assembly. The National Assembly would also have to be peopled by people who understand that it is in our long-term interest, if we're going to remain as one country, to have that conversation, irrespective of whether or not you're dislodged from your own power block. But currently, most of the things that are being done and being said are tailored to the preservation of certain advantages that some people believe that they have, and which, to my mind, are mostly tenuous, as the tensions in various parts of the country clearly demonstrate. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you very much. And I also think that Honorable Minister needs to talk a little bit. I found the lecture you gave at the Obasanjo Library very, very insightful.
Lecture, this event on my time for 11 o'clock. When it was ending, the letters I will attend at 11 for 11:30. So, but when I was coming here now, and I looked back at your email, and it was 9:30 to 11, and so I got it all wrong. I was even in my house delaying to come here saying I had 11. So Sorry for coming in late. I look forward to listening to Professor. I've gone to look at some of your previous writings, quite insightful, showing deep knowledge of Nigeria and Africa and the challenges that we face. But in just a brief from what the minister had said earlier on, for me, I don't think a government can evolve in Nigeria, can come to power on the basis of 1999 Constitution, on the basis of upholding and defending the 1999 Constitution, and midway, you start calling for national conference. I think there's something fraudulent about it. I think the person that must do a national conference must come to power clearly in his manifesto saying, I am coming to have a new conversation about Nigeria. And all the people who are elected to the National Assembly on that party platform will be coming, knowing fully well that the national conversation is about to happen. So that is the problem of Jonathan's conference, that's the problem of Obasanjo's conference. Economy that is thriving without any form of government. There is no quota system in our film industry. So there is Nollywood, there is Kannywood, there is Yoruba movie, there is Hausa movie. Nobody is asking for federal character, nobody is asking for quota system. Nobody is saying they are technologically disadvantaged from making movies. Nobody have said Yoruba is technologically disadvantaged from having a Yaba corridor. Because it is that Nigeria, that space where our boundless energies come out. And I think that the future of Nigeria is dependent on being able to find out the reason for our existence and then making sure that Nigerians freely subscribe to that reason. Then I think we can have a nation where no man is oppressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Jerry, just very, very brief comments. Thank you. I know I see why they were very glad to have you share some words. I mean, if there is a version of the lecture, I would certainly enjoy reading it, and maybe we can see. I would love to see it. And I think, by the way, you've dealt with one very critical issue that came up here, namely not only opportunities to express ideas and so on, but some kind of a commitment and even authority to be able to act. And I think you've come up with a very important way of bridging that. Right, just a few closing ideas. The first, and I'm very glad you brought up the issue, but what was the purpose for which some of these had taken place? But there were other meetings that had taken place at earlier occasions when it was really a more open kind of discussion and not driven by some kind of political, personal thing. So it's important to get that point in mind. I think it's important in going forward, and I'm certainly convinced about the need for this conversation, moving forward in a much more systematic kind of a way. But we have to bear in mind that, just thinking of recent calls for national conference and national sovereign conference, growing out of June 12th in 1993, and, the fear and the concern that this is really meant to be, a way in which the, dismantling of Nigeria is going to come about, or that it might be, a sense of Nigeria moving to a confederation or so on. I'm saying that that bear this in mind, that as one is thinking of what kind of a process that goes on, that if it appears that the end point is included in the way it is set up, right? So if you say what the term restructure would mean to some people, some people might take restructure means, some form of, of a dismantlement or so on. This saying that you need to really think about it, and words matter in terms of it. All right. The second thing is, one of the, it might be known to a few of you here, but certainly to Iberi, but one of the articles that my students read in this course on governing fractured nations was an article written by Henry Beenan. And Henry Beenan, he was president of Northwestern for 15 years and also, headed Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. But he also taught at the University of Ibadan and University of Nairobi. And so they read, one of the articles they read was on state and ethnicity in Africa. and this was published in a volume in 1983. But one of the points that Sklar made in that, and he really had Nigeria and Ethiopia, other countries in mind, was about the importance of formulas and narratives, and the role of the elites, and you all are part of the elite, the role that they play in the devising of those formulas and those narratives, and how that can shape, what follows. So bear that in mind, that you're really, in the process of rethinking the formulas and narratives for Nigeria. Then the last one is, Richard Sklar, has been mentioned here, and Richard Sklar, two of his ideas I would mention here, just in this thinking about Nigeria, and especially, this thing about Nigeria, Nigeria national policy. Richard Sklar, he talks about, in one of his articles, about one of the contributions of African governance to political science. And he really had Nigeria a lot in mind. What was he called? Dual majesty. And his idea of dual majesty was saying that, and you can see it reflected in Peter Eke's Two Publics and so on, that he's saying that, well, in Nigeria, there is really a sense of authority that, derives from, the civic public, the state, all the things we know. And then there is another authority that comes from, how people define themselves in various ways. And to bear that in mind. And the last thing about Sklar that is just so relevant, again, to thinking about Nigeria. And this is when Sklar would talk about workshops of democracy. He'll use this term, workshops of democracy. And the fact is that Nigeria has been one of the preeminent workshops of democracy. All of these meetings is what we're talking about are really workshops where people are coming out and trying to work out. Okay?
Today, that would not have been possible without the help and support of the U.S. Embassy, especially Larry Sosha, and my friend Bimbo Aboloade, who brought all of us together. He's not here today, but I thank you very much. The discussion shouldn't end because we're bringing this to a close. We've got some little tapas and stuff outside, and we hope that you hang around and we continue the discussion because I've got, again, like you, some ideas on how we can take these conversations forward. But thank you for making time to join us this morning, and we really appreciate it. Thank you.